All right, guys. Just wanted to thank you all for joining. Welcome. This session is the MyIT Service Broker training on the installation and configuration for our partners. We have a number of you on the line, so once again, thank you. Giving this presentation, you're going to have myself. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Simon Geddes. I'm the product manager of MyIT Service Broker. On the line, we have John Gallagher, who probably a lot of you do know. He's the guy that deals with a lot of these issues on a daily basis, so he'll be walking you through some configuration. Tony Chung is the guy that writes a lot of the documentation and deals with a lot of customers and partners and has a wealth of knowledge around this. And last but not least, Hugh Fairfield, who's our principal product developer. He'll be answering your questions through the Q&A window on the WebEx. Why we're doing this? We just had an overwhelming demand from the field and our partners in terms of getting you up and enabled to start providing these skills and services to our customers. This is a bit of I hate to say it, but it's a bit of a band-aid till we get to official certification for our digital workplace offering. We just have to get you guys out in the field being able to do this instead of going direct to us all the time. And we really want to focus on enabling you, and hopefully this session will really help that. Housekeeping, please save the questions to the end. We will probably, yesterday it took about an hour and a half for the entire session when we did it to our professional services team, so there should be some time there to handle any of your questions. I've got questions to be asked through the chat. It's actually the Q&A window. I was just told about that, so please focus any questions there. And please, I'm going to try to make this a monthly session. And any sessions or any issues you're running into, please fire them my way. You can either throw them in the Q&A window or just send me an email, and I'm more than happy to schedule a session, and we'll get the right people in the room to help you guys out. And then the last is please mute your phones, but with our new system, I think you got muted on the way in. We're going to be walking through two pieces, two main sections, and one's in the installation, which is going to cover the actual prerequisites, what you need to get up and running, and then Tony will do a step-by-step walkthrough of an installation with an Oracle database. And second will be done by John. He's going to run you through the configuration, and that'll involve high availability, SSL, RSSO, and integration service patch. On that note, Tony, I'm going to hand it over to you.
I'm Tony Chung, as Simon said. I'm the documentation dude for the MyIT Service Broker project and some other related MyIT work. One of the things that we're going to talk about today are just basic installation on a Linux system with an Oracle database, just to get people up to a proof of concept running level. This is the kind of system that we use in QA, and this is the kind of system I've been testing on for documentation. There are other deployment scenarios that we can discuss later on, but that'll be in future sessions as well. As we start documenting those things out, we'll be able to get those things documented as well. So this is the setting. Sorry, how do I get to the screen? This is the system that we're building today. It's the gray box is a single machine where we have a database and the AR system application platform and the application itself. So you can sort of see here that the database is separated out into two table spaces. There's tenant data. There's the application data, which is used by the Service Broker app, and then the tenant data, which is all of the catalog service items and other details that go into your service catalog profiles and workflows and things. The application platform, the application stack here shows the main platform system and the application connecting to a REST API. There's an outbound API, which is your catalog API used by MyIT, and there's the two-way API, which is connections used. Actually, they're both two-way APIs. One of them is the connections goes to the fulfillment systems, and the catalogs go to MyIT, so you can sort of see how these things are connecting. We're not going to be setting up MyIT and the fulfillment systems in this demo. Now, I have to preface this again by saying that we can't really install a full, the full installation in real time, just because of the fact that it takes about 20 minutes or 40 minutes to run the installation. So I have set up the system and a bunch of slides to sort of highlight the gotchas that happen with most people when they install a system. All right. So our prerequisites And these have been concerns that have come up through our customer support chain, through the escalations. A lot of people are noticing that the server always has to be connected to the internet in order to run your updates and the server updates and to download all the dependencies. And a lot of people are still just getting familiar with Linux. I know BMC has been primarily a Windows shop and done some Linux stuff as well, but this application is only running on Linux at this time. And the other concern that supporters notice is that we have to install as the root user, because that mitigates any of the problems that people had with installing dependencies and upgrading libraries and stuff like that. But there are other methods that we can use to change to reroute this so that you don't need to be root user. But just for the purpose of this demo, to simplify everything, we're just going to use everything as a root user. And as I'm currently a Windows user, I'm using Git for Windows because it has a great bash shell that I've got. I think I've even got it running in the background here. There you go. Let's take a look. All right, I restarted my server. It's excellent. Okay, so now that we understand all that stuff, let's just go over the compatibility a little bit. The on-premises is the one. The on-premises is what we're looking at. You all know that for a MyIT Service Broker 3.3 installation, you need to be running MyIT 3.3. The platform change from 3.2 to 3.3 is significant enough that we are recommending that we only support the ITSM stack 8.1 Service Pack 2 and above. And if you need to, because you want to use the approvals, you need to run an integration patch on your ITSM servers, and John will go over that section later on. In terms of your server that I'm using to install this, I'm actually using a Red Hat 7 system with an Oracle 11.204 database, and the whole disk, the combined computer is 100 gigabytes between the two, shared between both the database and the application stack. Installation in 5 parts. We have 5 different steps, global steps that have to be run in order. I usually just sort of say there's a collect step, there's a preparation step, you run the installer, which includes the updating configuration files, and then you set up your tenant data, and you apply your server and your user licenses. Right? So let's break these down a little further. The kind of information that you need to collect are all the values that you're going to need to eventually fill out your configuration forms and complete prompts. All these are documented in the installing section under the MyIT SP33 docs. But the first category are all the installation options that are run in your options.txt file. Now, just to back this up a little bit, to simplify the installation, we're only running, if you've installed Remedy before, you know that you've usually got a Windows GUI or a Linux GUI and a silent install option. For Service Broker, we just run the silent installation, so all the options that you see here are entered into the options.txt file that is used to feed the silent installer. The options that I've highlighted here in the dotted lines, they relate to specifically the platform, the Air System 9.5 platform that we're loading first, and then everything else relates to either the database or it's all pretty much Service Broker specific database install information. Then there's also the Java piece. This little bit here says Java home path find later. I'm guessing that when you first configure your system, you're not going to know the exact location of your Java path, so later on we're going to find that and plug that in. Right? As far as tenant information, these are things that you would either have in your options text, which are consistent with the rest of your options.txt file, or things that you need to create and that you're asked for when you actually get to the step of creating your tenant. So in this case here, we're going to be using tenantcalbro.com. I'm using the same username as the tablespace name because Oracle requires a separate user for every tablespace. You could change this username to something else, but you guys got to make sure that you use that username consistently in your plans. Then the third piece of information that you should collect is the license key, which is usually grabbed when you can apply for a license key or register a license key once you know your server address, right? So what I've done is I ran my server, ifconfig on my server, found out my MAC address, obtained my Air license, and this is the license that we're using. Actually, this is the license from my other server, but that's okay. You get the idea what we're talking about here. The preparation step is after you've provisioned your servers, so we provision our 100 gigabyte box, we go through a series of, I guess this is a basic checklist that I wrote up just to help simplify the install for me. So one of them is that we download the files. All right, that's great, because you can start the download. It's a 5.5 gigabyte download, so you can just download it in the background and do all your other work that you're doing while the files are downloading. And then you're going to update your server libraries. I'm trying a couple of different things here. With my first server, I updated all the server libraries using an update command to make sure everything's at the current level. You may be able to get away with just doing some updates as required, but we'll talk about that after. Then I said check for Java location, check temp folder, and ensure all the database stuff is running. So let's just go through each of these steps one at a time. Simplest way I found to download the files was to request them through your EPD account, get to your directory, and then once you get the email that forwards you to your link, you just copy the link location. And then you go into your server and you just use wget-b and then the FTP link that you copied. That works really well to just get your files onto your system really quickly. I've tried it different ways where I download it to my hard drive and then tried to re-upload it, and it took hours. So this one took only like maybe minutes. So I recommend doing wget as much as you can. To update the server libraries, I just ran a yum update. You could probably also run a yum upgrade if you want to upgrade your server entirely. I did that on one of my servers as well, and didn't have any ill effects on that. So that all works well. I accepted every update, so I had like 640 megabytes of updates in the last time I ran this. To check for the Java location, there were two options I used. One was which Java, one is update alternatives. On the Red Hat system that we're using, the update alternative seems to provide the best version. It gives you an actual list saying current best version is, and it gives you the whole location of where the Java is. And the only part you need to remember is the part in red here, up to the JRE. That's the part that you're going to go back to your options.txt file and then, or your information collection table, and add this into that. For every build of Service Broker up to 3.3 GA, you've had to have an almost unlimited temp folder allotment. It's actually 20 gigabytes, but as far as that's concerned, that's almost unlimited. The team has been working to mitigate this so that you don't need to have a full temp space allotment. So that's being fixed in the patch, but at this point in time, I just asked my IT department to release the quota on the temp space folder so that we could extract all the files and run the installation, and then we can get them to put the limitation back on the temp space because you don't need it after you've installed the application. To ensure that Oracle database is running, first thing I did was I logged into our Oracle, because Oracle's on the same machine, right? I just went to the Oracle administration panel, logged into SQL Plus, and then noticed that it said connected to an idle instance. That meant my database was not running, so I started it up. There's some other prompts that there's some other information blurbs that came out, and then it finally told me database mounted and database opened. So that was good. That was great. And then I checked, because I wanted to do a fresh install. I wanted to make sure that the table spaces that I was planning on creating with the installer and with my tenant creation didn't already exist. So I used these two commands, select username and select table space, to determine if the table spaces were there and if the users were there. And if they were, I just dropped them. You could opt instead to just create new table spaces during those steps. You don't have to necessarily drop your table spaces, but for my install, I wanted to drop everything, start from clean, so I could do a completely fresh install. The last step is you exit to the root Oracle prompt, the root Oracle administrator prompt, and run your listener. When I checked listener control status, I found that it wasn't available to accept connections, so then we ran start to start the database up so we could actually hear connections to the database. At this point, you should have the files downloaded on your system. So at this point, you're going to extract them. You're going to update your options to match your info, and then you're going to run the install, and then deal with any errors that come up. So the first one is we extract the installer files. Now the docs that I wrote suggest putting them into a folder, a simple folder called install, and then you can have everything related to your install in this one folder. You may have other ways that you want to do this, but this is just the way I found to keep everything organized for me. When I used VI to open the options text, I just edited all the options to match my settings. You probably all know this stuff. If you're not familiar with VI, I got a great cheat sheet link here that you can follow later on. And the install routine runs really quickly. It's just .install, and then you're done. Once you get through the hardest part is reading the end user license agreement. And then after you hit Q and enter, and then you accept except you want to install it, it just says extracting the files and then installing the AR system. At that point, you can actually open a second window. That's kind of what I did here. I've got this window called with a log. So while one of them was running, I ran a log, and I just had them both going at the same time, like this. So installation took about 40 minutes. Sometimes it doesn't take 40 minutes. Sometimes within the first 2 minutes, you get an error saying you're missing some dependencies. If you've updated your system, chances are you aren't missing those dependencies, but if you do, there's a great script that's already written here called install dependencies. The other one is if you're missing or you've transcribed your Java path wrong. And the other one, this is the big gotcha that we found recently, is that if you have updated your system to the latest grade of 7.2, 7.3, chances are the libstandard C++ the C++ library here, it's using a different version that's not compatible with our installer. So what I had to do is I had to do a RPM-E to erase it, or to remove it, and then RPM-I to actually download the file and then add it. It'll tell you, your system will tell you exactly which version you need. And then this is the success. This is what you get at the success. This is great. After you've successfully installed your system, you can set up your tenant information, and it takes a couple of steps. One of them is that you have to prepare the database for it, and then you can upload the data. So back to Oracle, we went back into the SQL Plus console, and then I took all of these commands, which are written in our documentation. I entered them into a text file like this, and then I changed all of the information to match what I wanted, and I updated all the commands here. So I just copied them, and then you just copy them and paste them one at a time into your terminal window to update the user credentials and then update the table space objects, or set up your table space. And then you go back to restart your server, and then once you've started it, well, actually, I can change this now. System restart can only take 30 to 60 minutes if there's something dreadfully wrong with your server infrastructure entirely. It only takes about 15 to 20 minutes. It's quite fast now. Then we have a couple of extra scripts here where you start putting information into this the table space that you asked to create. So you create the schema, and then you create the tenant. Now, the reason why you need to create the tenant is because the initial load of the templates, the service templates, the categories, some of the other buckets that you're going to be filling in, all that is included in your tenant data. So you need to have all this stuff. Plus, this create tenant instruction creates your very first user, who is Hannah_admin. Then after this, you can apply your server and your user licenses using a mid-tier. I found that if you, what I found the easiest for me was I downloaded the AR server installation package and I loaded mid-tier right on my hard drive. Then I could create a mid-tier configuration. John's going to show how to go through the mid-tier configuration to switch servers, but I find that having one mid-tier on my hard drive to use as a client for my Service Broker platform made it really easy, so I can switch between the platforms a lot more easily on my system than having to go to a working mid-tier on another ITSM system, which you're already probably using for ITSM, right? You need the mid-tier for all sorts of administration and configuration, so it's good to have it handy. When you're installing it, you need to apply server licenses and user licenses with the mid-tier, but then some other things that come down the line are, for instance, updating the full-text search or administering RSSO or some of the other things that John's going to show you. Those have to be done with the mid-tier as well. So I've got documentation on how to configure the mid-tier to point to it, but I just learned recently that I can install on my hard drive, and that works so much faster than trying to figure out who's got a mid-tier that I can use right now. So to apply the server license, you go to the AR System Shared Licenses form, and you just add one AR server license, and that's that license key that you collected at the very beginning. And to apply the user licenses, for 3.3, you only need to have a license for every user who you plan to have logged into MyIT Service Broker as a catalog administrator, an internal supplier, or an asset manager to work within the Service Broker interface. Only those users who log into Service Broker need a type user license type fixed. MyIT users who are registered to your Service Broker don't need to have a fixed license. They can actually request services through the default read license that's applied. And then at this point, your installation is complete. That's all the steps there for that. All right.
Thanks, Tony. So everyone, my name is John Gallagher. Since joining BMC 6 years ago, I've been supporting SRM, MyIT, and Service Broker. And previously to that, I worked with an Irish partner for about 6 years, supporting TrueSight, BMC Portal Control M, ADDM, and BMC Blade Logic Client Automation. So in terms of the agenda for this session, I'm going to start off with Service Broker high availability, architecture, and configuration, followed by the various methods we use to support SSL. And then I'll go into how we use the integration server patch for approvals and AOR integration. And finally, we'll wind up how you configure our single sign-on solution across Service Broker, MyIT, and ITSM. So as you can see from the slide, we have a typical AOR server group, which is using a load balancer alias to route requests to either of the active servers. And if you notice, I actually have another load balancer alias, and this one will always be pointing at the primary AOR server. And it's used for mostly SB admin activities such as creating services. With regards to MyIT, it's actually configured to use the alias for either of the two servers. And as you can see, we've got a JDBC connection going to the database, and the AOR server group is using TCP to communicate. In terms of the prerequisites, obviously you'll need the mid-tier to configure. The object list needs to be enabled. The server group alias has to be consistent across both AOR servers. And obviously you'll need network connectivity before you perform this exercise. So I'd advise just doing a simple ping from each of the servers to ensure you have that connection. And of course, when you're setting it up on the load balancer, you will need a virtual IP address for both servers. So as far as the steps are concerned, pretty straightforward. Tony's already covered off the primary installation. Once that's done and you've set up your tenant database and you've run your scripts, you proceed to configure your mid-tier, followed by your primary AOR configuration, secondary install, and then configure your secondary server. And finally, you would add your load balancer alias for Service Broker into MyIT. So just a couple of parameters you need to bear in mind when you're kicking off the primary install in a HA server group environment. And that's the server group alias. As I said earlier, it needs to be consistent across both servers. And one thing I've also noticed on occasion is if you don't actually have the fully qualified domain name of the server itself, it can cause issues on the network side of things. So just to be on the safe side, I advise putting that into the file. The object list is actually documented online, so I just inserted a screenshot here. It's easy to get to, easy to set up. As soon as you log into the mid-tier configuration utility, all you need to do is tick the enable object list, and after that you need to import your definitions. Now this has to be done on the 9.5 server itself, and obviously you will use Developer Studio to import those files, but again, the instructions for that are contained within this importing the definitions files link. So most of you would be familiar with the mid-tier configuration tool. So as you can see, I've highlighted my 9.5 AOR server, and by default it's hard-coded to use the port of 9988. You can choose to use another port if you want, but for the purpose of this demonstration, I just went with the defaults. So to set that up, you need to provide the credentials to connect to the server. And once you connect, then you should be able to see both of the servers, your ITSM. So in my case here, I'm just using the mid-tier that I have for ITSM. And then what I'm doing is I'm choosing the 9.5 server from the drop-down list as my authentication server. So I'm switching from ITSM. And I'm also updating the preference server. So when I log into the mid-tier the next time or into ITSM, it automatically knows that it has to redirect to my 9.5 server. And again, just make sure you have the enable object list ticked. Once that's done and I log into the mid-tier, I'll be presented with a list of forms. Now, the server that you're looking at is the 9.5 server, but it will display as a mixture of a 9.5 and your ITSM server you're using it. So I've just filtered here on the 9.5 server. As you can see, I've circled the system administration form, which is the main form I will launch into to continue my configuration for the server group. Obviously, I need to tick the server group member box to make it aware, but I'll also have to update the etc host file. Now, this file, as you know, will contain the server name of the machine, but we also need to update it with the short name and the alias that we're going to use for our AOR server group. Once that's done, I need to proceed to enable global admin operations. And this is simply done by selecting the AOR system GUI and then just ticking shared. And then once I tick shared, I need to manually enter the value of disable-admin-ops global, which is circled here, and just set that to false. And of course, once these configuration changes have been made, I'll need to restart Service Broker by doing an AOR controller restart. So moving on to the secondary server, I've highlighted a few parameters here. Obvious one is the install. I'll leave the database option blank because it's essentially updating the local file system. It's not really updating the database. And then I'll need to enter the fully qualified domain name of the host as well as the server group alias. Next thing I'm going to do is to indicate that the server is also another member of the group. So I obviously tick the server group member box again. And then I need to disable the admin operations on the secondary server because admin operations are going to be performed on the primary server. Once I do that, I need to proceed to set it up for failover and for administration. So as you can see, I've circled administration for my primary server, and I'm setting it to rank 1, telling it that primary is an admin. And then for the secondary server, you can see it's 00627, which is my other server in the group, and setting it to rank 2. So when primary fails over, it knows it has to switch over to 00627. And of course, we need to restart Service Broker once again by performing an AOR controller restart. In terms of the load balancer, what I'm showing you here is F5. Of course, there may be other load balancing technologies that our customers may use, but for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just showing you how it's set up in my own system. So if you'll notice, I have 2 servers here. The one in green is obviously indicating that's an active server, and my other server, in this case, 0627, was down at the time. So both of those servers are going to be combined into if you like, a load balancer alias. And that load balancer alias is the one that's going to be used by MyIT to consume those Service Broker services. There's just one thing to point out here, and that's the system user isn't actually the user that's used to consume those services. I've seen a couple of cases and questions on that before. What's really used behind the scenes is actually the user that you're logged in to MyIT, and what's important is that user also exists on the Service Broker side. So moving on to SSL, there's 2 methods to set up SSL. There's a simple method by using the load balancer, and then there's the native configuration that we'll have to set up with Jetty. So as far as the load balancer is concerned, all we need to do is set it up on the F5 or whatever load balancer tool you're using, and then we export it and import the cert onto the MyIT side, and finally we configure MyIT. For native, we set up the certificate again, and then we have to configure Jetty to make it aware that it's supposed to use HTTPS. But we also have to update quite a number of Service Broker scripts, because if you notice, a lot of the Service Broker scripts would call other scripts which have the hard-coded HTTP value. And once we do that, then we import the MyIT key store, and then we configure MyIT. So as you can see, the F5 load balancer here on our system is simply switching to HTTPS using the secure port of 443. Once that's done and I launch Service Broker in my browser, if I look at the top, if you were to look on the top left-hand side, you'll see a little information icon. And if you click on that icon, it'll give you the option to view a certificate. And this is what you're looking at. So if you'll notice, like, you can see the owner, or you can see the server name, which is support.sb.bmc.com. And this is the actual certificate authority, which is Taute. Now, once we see that certificate, all we need to do is click on the View Certificate button, and then when you click on View, you save it locally. And once you save it locally, then you'll copy that certificate over to your MyIT server and import it. So in this example, I'm just giving you an example of a command that I'd use to import it into my own system. And once I do that, I restart Tomcat. On the native side of things, as I said, it's a little more complicated, or a little more time consuming rather to set up. So obviously the first thing we need to do is to get the certificate. And there's a number of methods you use to get the certificate. In this example, I'm just using a self-signed certificate. But generally, we'd recommend that your security team would handle the certificate side of things. And more often than not, they'll provide you with the necessary certificate, which you can subsequently use to configure Jetty for SSL. So once I have once my key store is generated and I have my certificate, what I then do is I would copy it over to the Jetty etc directory, and after that, I need to encrypt my password for the key store. So as you can see in this command, I'm using in Java mycp, and at the end of the command, you can see the plain text password of change it. Now, we don't want to update our Jetty configuration with the plain text password, so we use the obfuscate utility to do that. So the command that's after returning is as you can see OBF, and then there's a certain value here, and that's the encrypted value that I'm going to be using. And you can see it highlighted here. And this is the default path to the key store itself. Next thing we need to do is update the scripts. So the first one is the set scripts variable. The first two values have to be added manually. So obviously the first one is telling it to trust SSL certificates from the connector side of things. And then the second one is the connector base URL. So obviously it has to be HTTPS, and you can see the secure port there. And the same for the service URL and the Oracle server. And finally, the Gibraltar port. Moving on to the set ends of it, sh script. So the URL schema is, as you can see, has been highlighted as well as the port. And at the very bottom here, we add in a -k option. Now, the -k option here is actually added in to tell Service Broker to ignore any certificate errors. Because once once Service Broker is restarted, it'll start to, there's actually a lot of hard-coded curl commands that go off to try and retrieve data. And the -k essentially ignores all of those errors and it proceeds as normal. So moving on to the integration server patch. So the integration server patch should also be available on the EPD side. And we also have one for, we have an integration server patch both for Windows and for Linux. Once you download it and you unzip it, it's pretty straightforward to install, but it really covers off like two components, the AR integration as well as the approval server. So as far as the approval server is concerned, we handle a simple like manager level type of approval. There are some custom approvals that you can set up, and that's been documented online, and in fact Tony has done a section on that. So I'd recommend checking that out. So as far as the installation is concerned, you just run the installer on the server, and then once that's done, all you need to do is copy that remote action folder to the secondary AOR server. Once that's done, you need to configure the communication. And finally, we finish up with flushing the stub cache. So again, run the installer, enter the admin password, and click Next. And what that does is it lays down this folder, and as you can see, I've highlighted a remote action.batch file. And what this batch file is saying is to use obviously the JRE path, but it's telling ITSM to communicate, or how to communicate back to broker. So I'll explain a little more in the next couple of slides. And finally, we need to, as I said, flush the stub cache form. And to do that, we just enter the Service Broker's service request stub form here, and then we change the value of the application request ID. And once we save it, it flushes that cache, and then we're finished with our configuration. The last bit of configuration is to make ITSM aware of Service Broker. And to do that, we enter the values into our local and our remote approval form. And as you can see, I'm giving it a value of, I'm giving the remote username a value of HANA admin, and then I'm providing the endpoints that it's going to use to communicate back. And if you notice on the other side here, you can see the remote action.batch file, which again is going to be used to call to communicate back to Service Broker. In terms of the flow, quite simple, really at high level. Create the broker request. Entries created on the ITSM stub form. There's a status change, and then that status change calls that remote execute action batch file, and then the service request is updated on the Service Broker side of things. So at a very high level, you can see I'm using the create work order, and then I have a receive task set up, so that when the work order status changes, then it's going to fire that status back to broker. So I've set up a slide here just to give you an idea of the overall flow. So the first one is submitting a service broker request from MyIT. And what happens is it goes off to ITSM, and via the work order interface create form, it'll create that work order. So that's the end of the first process, if you like. But as far as getting that status back to Service Broker is concerned, you actually have to set up a filter to do that. Now, the instructions on how you do that are actually detailed online. In fact, I think there might be a video out there about it as well. But it's quite simple to set up. But once you have that filter set up, all it's doing is it's looking for a work order, or it could be like an instance, like you could set up another one for instance. Really depends, status change. And then when that status change happens, then it pushes a value to the SB service request stub form. And then once that value hits the request stub form, then at that point the connector stub on modify filter kicks in. It looks where it's supposed to go, and in this case obviously it's the remote approval configuration form. So okay, I need to route back to Service Broker, and again it uses that remote action.batch file to do that. On the approval side of things, quite similar. Service request is created with an approval is created from MyIT, and then what happens then is it hits the approval process, and then the approval process then reaches out to remote action. Status change is then sent on to broker, and that completes the cycle. So the flow is quite similar. Service request with the approval hits the stub form. filter kicks in to start the whole approval process, and it hits the chain at that point. Now this chain is actually installed when you install or it's actually laid down rather when you install the integration server patch. Now you can set up your own custom approval process. As I said earlier, Tony has documented that online. But once for this particular chain, once the manager approves that particular approval, the remote request on modify filter kicks in, and then it pushes a value to the request subform, and once again the remote action.batch is called, .bat file is called, and hits Service Broker, and the approval is then reflected within MyIT. As far as the process is concerned from Service Broker, it's actually just using the call activity. As you can see, we have request approval, and process once again creates the entry on stub form, does a cycle every 20 minutes, and loops. If it's not able to loop, it fails, and then if it's able to reach ITSM, it uses the receive task to send it on to the approval server, and then once the manager approves it, then it uses the remote action batch .bat file to send that back to Service Broker. And here's an example of the chain of the process that the integration server patch installs. At a high level, I decided to give you another example of how it's set up using Process Designer. So you can see here request approval, and what I'm highlighting here is approved. So I'm saying if it's approved, then send the status back to Service Broker, and obviously that's a conditional approval. Status equals approved. So moving on to RSSO, we support Remedy Single Sign-On 9.102 and AR System 9.1 Plus if you're using RSSO 9.102. I'd just like to point out we don't actually support ASSO. If you want to use single sign-on, BMC single sign-on, you need to use RSSO. So in terms of the overall flow, I did out a little diagram here just to give you an idea how it works from an AR authentication side of things. So the user logs into MyIT. Then at that point, there's actually an agent that intercepts that request, and then that agent then redirects you to the Remedy single sign-on page. And then, depending on your authentication method, in my case, again, I'm using AR auth, it'll send it off to the AR server, and then my credentials have been entered into, provided my credentials are accepted on the AR server, it sends it back to RSSO, and at that point, there's a token created. And once that token is created, we have a cookie on the browser, which is subsequently used for authentication between Service Broker, MyIT, and ITSM. To set it all up, we first start out with our realm configuration. Once we have a realm configured, we move on to copy over the required RSSO files. Then we have to update Service Broker configuration, and then we move on to EA options, followed by the agent integration, and finally setting it up to ignore the tenant domain. So in terms of the realm, by default, RSSO will have a realm set up. It's just a star. You can create your own realm, whatever name you want. But in this case, I have set up my MyIT, ITSM, and Service Broker server to use the coffee.com tenant that I set up for Broker. What's important here is that you set the user ID transformation to remove email domain, and that you also run, if you intend setting up ITSM and AR system with RSSO, that you also run the installer for both AR system and the mid-tier. For those of you who are familiar with 3.2, you might recall we had to manually copy certain files over to the broker server. With 3.3, we no longer have to do that. There's actually a directory, it's a hidden directory within AR System Home. So once you navigate to that directory, you'll find all of these files, and obviously for our RSSO to work from a service broker point of view, they have to be copied to the relevant directories here: deploy, conf, and plugin server. Once that's done, then we need to go about configuring Service Broker. And what's important here is that first of all, that the agent ID, as you can see, is MyIT SB ITSM, is consistent across all of the servers. So in my case, the MyIT Tomcat server will have to have the same agent ID, and the ITSM Tomcat, or the mid-tier Tomcat server, will have to have the same ID as well as Service Broker. And I've also highlighted the RSSO web filter. So this is what's really kind of catching the URL and telling it to, at this point, redirect to the RSSO login page. You can see I've highlighted it here: SSO external as well as the SSO service URL. Next thing we need to do is comment out the old Atrium SSO entries within the plugin configuration.xml file. I'd just like to point out here, you need to be very, very careful with this file. If you have any sort of a typo, or if you comment out the less than or equal to or exclamation, or if you use the wrong comment, then it can cause all sorts of problems. So just be warned. And also, when we've commented out the SSO, we obviously need to update the configuration to tell it to use the area plugin. And obviously, it's important that you have the correct paths in here to the RSSO area plugin as well as the JSON. And then we need to comment out the Pentaho and AOR migrate entries from the AOR.conf. And as far as the RSSO configuration is concerned, then we simply need to add in our RSSO URL here. And finally, we need to update the set scripted variables.sh file with the tenant name, which is obviously coffee.com in my case. Once that's done, we have to make AOR system aware that it needs to use the AOR-S area plugin, but we also have to bear in mind that this needs to be done for both the system and the application user, which is HANA admin in our case. So once that's updated and you apply it, you restart Service Broker, an AOR controller restart, and that completes it from the Service Broker side of things. And now we need to update the mid-tier, to ignore the tenant. And we do that by editing the configuration.properties file. Once you create an RSSO authentication properties file, you set the ignore tenant to true. And obviously you need to restart Tomcat for that to take effect. And of course we do the same thing for MyIT. But in this case, we're going to be updating the SSO SDK properties file. And again, set it to true and restart Tomcat. And that's it.
Well, I get the final slide of it. It's just a wrap-up and question slide. I just want to thank you all for joining and being on the call. I hope that was really useful. A couple things before we jump into more questions, if there are any, is I sent a few of you a private message via chat. I didn't know what company you were from. If you can just reply that in the chat window, that would be great. I just want to keep track of the people that are attending these. And for those call-in users, I think there was 3 of them. If you can quickly just send me an email that you were actually on the phone, that would be greatly appreciated. To sum it up, you're going to see, and actually put this in the chat, we're going to follow up with a link for everyone to a blog and actually the recording of the video for your reference. So that should be coming out in the next week or so. We just got to convert these slides and so forth to a chat and provide a way where we can have like a living, breathing document and we can learn from each other. That being said, is there any two things just before we get into open questions? Please think of ideas for next sessions. It could be workflows, catalog creation, any deeper dive of what Tony and John presented you today. Any advice there would be great, so we know what you guys want to hear. And finally, I'm just going to open the floor to questions, as you have John, Tony, myself, and Hugh on the phone, so we should be able to tackle most things there. So please just fire away.
So Guru has a question, I believe, on SQL Server. Were there any? Yeah, I think he's asking if there's any slides for that.
There's no slides for it here, but we do document kind of how to set up your SQL Server tables in the documentation for the installation. SQL Server is a little bit more simple, actually a lot more simple than the Oracle. In fact, it's so simple I had to ask questions because it didn't seem complex enough for me. The difference is just because of the different architecture. Oracle requires a different user for every table space, whereas SQL Server, you just need to have one master user who has access to both table spaces. And that's kind of how there's some confusion in the docs because we're creating a user we're editing a user and then we're creating a user at the same time. So I got to fix that to clean that up, to explain exactly how simple the SQL Server install is.
All right, thank you, everyone. Once again, we'll follow up with links to a blog explaining everything we walked through and a link to the video. Also summarize some of the questions that were caught in the Q&A window, mainly from Sam and Christoph, so thank you guys for asking those questions. On that note, we're right at 9 o'clock our time, so have a good one, everyone, and I look forward to having another meeting with you guys in a month or so. Cheers.